Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Baizhu guide. Baizhu is a character who we've been waiting for so long now, and he is finally out as a Dendro support slash healer who's actually quite flexible and good at what he does. Because of that, what we're going to do is cover everything you need to know about Baizhu regarding the best ways to play and build him, talking about his best artifacts, weapons, teams, constellations, and just everything else. Before we begin though, I do want you guys to know that I had a lot of time to play Baizhu before he came out on a media server to help give you guys as much accurate information as possible. And lastly, I wanted you guys to know, as always, that I do stream most nights on Twitch. Link in the description if you're interested in watching me live. And with that being said, let's get into it. All right, so starting things off, let's talk about what Baizhu actually does by looking into his abilities and playstyle. Now, first things first, Baiju's elemental skill is an ability where he will shoot out a sort of Dendro snake that will hit opponents 3 times and then come back to him and heal all of your party members when he does return. This ability actually has a surprisingly good amount of healing for an elemental skill ability, as it is one that will heal all 4 of your party members at the same time, so it is quite valuable. It also has a 10-second cooldown and will apply Dendro once while also getting you some energy. Do keep in mind that the damage of this ability does scale on your attack, whereas the healing part scales on your HP, which is typically what you're focusing on, but we will go over that later in the build section. And so you typically won't be doing that much damage with this ability, although the healing is very nice. Now moving on, for your elemental burst, this is the main ability of Baizhu that has a ton of different properties. The main thing that it does though is give you these small shields, shielding your active character, being generated once every 2.5 seconds. These shields will absorb Dendro damage more efficiently, and their strength will scale on your HP. Now do keep in mind, how tanky shield is really is not that impressive. The scaling is not that high, and while it can tank some hits, typically its main use is the convenience that it gives you of being shielded and having that resistance interruption. Charge-shotting characters, for example, can really love to have a shield, even if it is one that will get destroyed rapidly, as even if the hit you're tanking is really big, you won't get interrupted from a charge shot or from whatever animation you're doing. With that said though, what the shield actually does is much more important than just the convenience of being shielded, as every time a new shield is generated or your shield is shattered or expires, your active character will be healed and will also attack nearby opponents for a bit of Dendro damage. Now, something I wanted to point out about this ability is that Baiju's Dendro damage is mostly single target, and the same can be said about his Dendro application. Like, yeah, most of it has a small AoE, so if enemies are really grouped up, you can hit all of them at once, but typically most of his attacks and stuff are single target, so do keep that in mind. Overall though, this ability is pretty decent at applying a consistent amount of Dendro from off field. Despite it not being the fastest, it's still good for the Dendro application on top of the small shields that you're getting, the bit of damage, and also the pretty significant amount of healing you're getting from both his elemental burst and his elemental skill. This ability has a 20-second cooldown with an 80 energy cost, meaning you will need a lot of energy recharge on this character to get it back, although there are some ways to play around it. Now, other properties to note before we actually dive a bit more into how much he's healing and how much damage he's doing is that, first of all, he gains healing if your active character is under 50% HP. He'll gain some healing bonus, whereas if they're over 50% HP, then Baizhu will gain Dendro damage bonus instead, which is typically better, but both can be quite useful. Lastly, your second passive talent is actually quite nice, as the characters who get healed by the shields generated from your elemental burst will get their reaction damage buffed based on the HP of your Baizhu. Every 1000 max HP that he has, up to 50,000, will increase the reaction damage of Burning, Bloom, Hyper Bloom, and Burgeon by 2%, and the aggravate and spread damage by 0.8% of your active character. This buff will last for 6 seconds, and as we said, will only proc once your active character is healed, so there can be a little bit of a delay between swapping into another character and actually getting healed once. Also worth noting that the buffs you're gaining from this passive talent last for 6 seconds, which means that it can last even after you run out of shields, and it is also technically possible to buff multiple characters if you swap into one and then swap into the other. Each will be buffed for the 6 seconds after they get healed, but this is a bit more niche, and usually you're focused on one character dealing most of your reaction damage. With that said though, this buff is actually very relevant if you are running a reaction based team, and most Dendro teams are. Things to note is that since this scales on HP and your healing scales on HP as well, you typically are going to be building HP as much as you can up until 50,000 to maximize not only your healing but also your reaction damage and make your Baizhu a really good support. With that said, you can also build your Baizhu for his personal damage because he is a Dendro catalyst, which means all of his attacks will be Dendro, so he can be an on-field driver in reaction-based teams or quick swap teams where you may not have another character who can be on field, and Baizhu can kind of spend some time there as well. With that said, his personal damage is not only very single target, but is also not the highest. It can be fun to play and it can be viable, especially when used as a driver, meaning that he's there to apply Dendro more so than anything else. And so that is a viable playstyle, but typically his more generic role is being used as an off-field support who will stack HP and heal your team while applying Dendro. And last, I wanted to mention that for your talent priority, you should focus on your burst, generally speaking, because there's so many scalings that go up here, and then also leveling your elemental skill, and then either ignoring your normal attacks if you use them from off-field, or leveling them up if you do choose to use him him on field. Also, while this isn't really relevant to his kit, I thought it was worth mentioning that his exploration passive, which heals you when you loot certain harvestable items like flowers and stuff, is actually quite nice for exploration, as it will heal your current active character, so pretty cool. With that out of the way, how good is Baizhu? Well, first of all, let's start by talking about his healing. So as I said, his healing is definitely good, or good enough to be a good solo healer for your team without needing more healing. He doesn't heal the most, but he definitely heals a good amount. What's nice about Baizhu though is that he also, on top of just healing, gives you a decent amount of single target damage and dendro application, as well as providing you with some small shields. And so with that said, how good is Baizhu? Well, honestly, I think he's a pretty good character, pretty solid, similar to Yao Yao in the sense that they are both dendro healers, but they vary in the sense that Yao Yao is a bit more AoE focused and Baizhu is a bit more single target focused because his AoE is very small and it's very hard to apply dendro on multiple enemies at the same time. But one of Baiju's biggest strengths is actually the fact that you don't need to swap into him very often at all. In fact, because Baiju's burst has a pretty long uptime of 14 seconds plus like the shield duration from the moment you get the last one, this means that you don't really need to swap into him to like refresh this up until the cooldown is back up, being 20 seconds after you use your burst for the first time. What this means in practice is that with characters that need a lot of field time, like Cyno or Alhaitham, it can be really convenient to play them with Baizhu. As someone who plays Cyno a lot, it is very annoying when I clear one wave of enemies and I have to swap back into my Nahida to remark them, or if for example my Yao Yao's Yugui expires and I have to swap back into her. What Baizhu lets you do is basically constantly have this decent amount of off-field dendro application, and while it isn't the fastest and it is quite single target, which are the main weaknesses, it is definitely enough and a really nice amount, especially for something like a Quicken team where you don't need that much off-field dendro application to proc your aggravates on Cyno or get the Quicken aura on enemies when you run a Electro support, to where it's just really nice overall. You have this nice role of dendro application, healing, shielding, a bit of damage, and all of that from off-field without really needing to think about it or swap into him all that often. It is therefore very convenient for these characters that have a long field time, but then he is also usable in just most generic dendro teams where you want a bit more dendro, and oftentimes, as I said, since his dendro application isn't the fastest, you might want to run him with another dendro character, especially because it can help alleviate his energy, because you do need a lot of energy on this character. Generally speaking, he's good in many different team comps if you want a 2-in-1 dendro healer. I also wanted to mention that his flexibility as being able to be used from on field, since he is a catalyst, is something worth noting, because yeah, his personal damage isn't that high, especially if you're building HP, but also if you don't need that much healing, you can technically build him attack as well, which we'll cover shortly, and get an okay amount of damage from him from on field if you want to run him as a driver. And so those are my thoughts on him. It is still day one, so it is a bit early to determine how good he is, but I do think he is a pretty strong unit, pretty versatile and viable support who has his strengths and weaknesses, but who overall I've really been enjoying playing, especially with characters like Cyno or in double dendro teams, which we'll talk about later. So someone I really like and I'm very happy with as a support, but one who is also like replaceable and not a character who you should feel forced to pull for, although he is definitely, in my opinion, a good character. All right, now with that out of the way, let's actually get into how you're gonna build your Baizhu. So starting things off, for the artifact sets that are good for him, I would typically recommend running him on a supportive set to help increase your team's overall DPS by as much as possible. What that typically means is running the Deepwood memory set if you are running a dendro based team, being a team comp that relies either on dendro damage or on dendro reactions. Because of that, the 4-piece Deepwood is a perfect set for your Baizhu, since he will constantly be dealing damage from his elemental skill and burst, decreasing the dendro resistance of opponents by 30%. This set is insane, and someone in your team should definitely be running this, and so there's usually no better option than your Baizhu. Now with that said, you could be running another dendro character who's already on the set, and that is fine. However, do note that typically running Baizhu on 4 Deepwood, since his personal damage isn't really his main focus, can be very efficient, as it would allow your other character to run a more offensive set, like 4-piece Gilded on your Nahida for example, instead of having to run her or like Alhaitham or whoever else you're running on the Deepwood set, which would lower their DPS more. So generally, 4-piece Deepwood is really good for your team. You want to make sure you have it on someone, and Baizhu is a good holder of it, who will also gain some dendro damage bonus from the 2-piece, although there are definitely some other viable supportive sets, like the 4-piece Instructor, if you can get past the fact that it's a 4-star set and are getting less stats, the 4-piece Ocean Hued Clam, if you want a bit more healing and some passive damage from a bubble that will explode and deal damage scaling on how much you're actually healing, and while Baizhu can't fully cap the bubble, still a nice amount of passive damage that makes it viable, but usually not the most recommended option. Regarding the Tenacity, the Millet set, the 2-piece is really good for giving you 20% HP, but then the 4-piece will increase the attack percent and shield strength of your party members when your skill hits an opponent. However, do note that your Baizhu won't have the best uptime on this set, as his skill will really just hit opponents for a bit and then stop, and so it kind of lasts when you're off field. It lasts for a little bit, it lingers for a bit. The uptime isn't that great, so it's viable if you want the HP and a bit of a buff, but do note that other characters would have a better uptime with the set, and this set also becomes more viable with Baiju's second Constellation, which we'll talk about in the Constellation section a bit later. Overall though, I do just recommend going a supportive set for your Baizhu, but there are many many options. Other than the ones I mentioned, you could also go for a two-piece. Mix and matching two-piece sets of any of the viable ones that give him stats like HP percent two pieces, energy recharge, or even EM or damage if that's what you're going for. You could also go for 4-piece Noblesse Oblige if you already have a Deepwood user, or 4-piece either Gilded or Flower of Paradise Lost if you want to stack Elemental Mastery in something like a Bloom team, although that's not typically his recommended playstyle. Now with that out of the way, what stats do you actually want on your Baizhu? Well, Baizhu is a character who scales on a few different things. His healing and your passive that will buff your reaction damage both scale on your HP, so that's typically what you're going to stack. However, you also need enough energy recharge to use your burst on cooldown, and that can be a lot on Baizhu. On top of that, your damage scales with attack and or elemental mastery depending on the reactions you're proccing, so there can be a few different ways to build him, although generally speaking, you're going for this supportive buffing and healing playstyle where you will stack primarily energy recharge and HP percent. Because of that, you will look for either energy recharge or HP on your sands, HP on your goblet, and HP on your circlet, unless you're running a Favonius Codex and need some crit rate, in which case a crit rate circlet can also be viable, although HP is typically recommended for most builds. Now, while there are some other builds that we'll also address, I first want to talk about how much energy recharge your Baizhu actually needs, and while this highly depends on the team you're running and playstyle, rotation, all of that, it usually is a big amount. Now, keep in mind, if you're running 2 Dendro characters, you will need significantly less, and if you're running Baizhu as a solo Dendro, you'll need a bit more. And so while you definitely can run another Dendro character with your Baizhu to make his energy needs a lot more attainable and realistic, a lot of Dendro teams will still just only run one because there's so many really good flex options you can run. So how much you need really varies on your team comp, but generally it ranges from usually around 200 to 250 in solo Dendro, but they can be a bit lower, like 180 if you're using 2 skills per rotation versus 1. And then in a double Dendro team, you'll need quite a bit less, somewhere around 160 to 200, again, varying on your team, rotation, and many factors. So be sure to test out what works for you. As I said, I do typically like running him with another Dendro character. It's just that not every team will do that because he's pretty flexible and can be used in many different team comps. So do test out what energy recharge works for you and your team comp. Lastly, for some other builds, if you want to play Bloom, you can stack Elemental Master on everything, and if you want to focus on his damage as an on-field driver, while you can still go HP and kind of neglect his damage a bit because it's not that big anyways, you could also choose to go for more offensive stats like Dendro damage on the goblet, crit rate or crit damage on the circlet, and then either attack percent or elemental mastery on the sands depending on what you're doing. Like attack is a more general option, and then EM if you're proccing spread, if you want to maximize his personal damage and neglect his healing, as honestly oftentimes just a little bit of healing is enough if you're dodging and playing well. So because of that, there are a few different ways to play him. This second build I would only recommend from on field, and if you're very comfortable and don't really need the healing, although generally speaking, stacking HP on him and energy recharge is the play to not only provide you with adequate healing, but also the buffs from your passive talent, which is very important for increasing your reaction damage. Next up, let's talk about what weapon you want to use on Baizhu, and this section is going to be especially important as the right weapon can make this character feel so much better. Now, as we saw in the artifact section, what Baizhu primarily wants is going to be HP and energy recharge. Because of that, the weapons that you're going to be going for are going to either give you energy or HP or both. And what that means in practice is the following. First of all, his best in slot weapon is obviously going to be the signature 5-star Jadefall Splendor, which was made for him. This is because the weapon will give you a ton of HP, as well as a passive that will restore some energy and give your team elemental damage bonus based on how much HP your Baizhu has. This is therefore going to be pretty good for just giving you a ton of stats and buffing your team, but it isn't a needed weapon, especially because generally speaking, Baizhu performs very well even without needing like the most investment, as he's not the character who's going to be dealing the most damage on your team. So a 5-star weapon on him typically isn't as big of an upgrade as on certain other characters. And so while this weapon is his best in slot, so use it if you have it, you shouldn't feel forced to pull for it. There are definitely great alternatives like the free-to-play prototype Ember, which is like a budget version of it. This weapon will give you HP percent while also restoring energy for all of your party members, as well as healing them a bit more when you use your elemental burst. This is going to be great for Baizhu as it gives him HP to stack up his healing and passive, while also providing him with a pretty significant amount of energy. At refinement rank 5, which you can get for free since it's a free-to-play craftable weapon, this 6 energy every 2 seconds for 6 seconds translates to 18 energy, which is quite nice and will greatly reduce how much energy recharge you actually need on this character. A similar weapon is the Favonius Codex, which just gives you a ton of energy to you and your team when you do crit, making it the other really good 4-star option that I would recommend. With that said, there's some other pretty good options too, like the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers is a good free-to-play option as well if you're running a hyper carry who scales on attack and you want to buff them. The main downside with this weapon is that Baizhu needs a lot of energy to spam his burst, but if you can make up for that in other ways, then Thrilling Tales is definitely going to be a good weapon and one that you can definitely use without spending a lot of resources, as it is a 3-star weapon with a very good effect. Now, other weapons that I wanted to mention include the Hakushin Ring, which gives you energy and can buff your team's damage if you're running electro characters, which is honestly really good. However, you need to know that you can only trigger the effect on field with your Baizhu, which means that this weapon gains a lot of value if you're either using your Baizhu on field or playing a quick swappy team where you're swapping into your Baizhu and at least doing a few hits on him before swapping. It therefore can be a pretty decent option in those electro-based teams, whereas my go-to recommendations are still the other ones that I mentioned previously. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that if you're playing him on field, have enough energy, and don't care about his healing, you can go for an offensive catalyst, like literally any 5-star or any of the crit 4-stars. And if you are using him purely to proc blooms, then you can just go for full elemental mastery on both your weapon and artifacts as mentioned. Overall though, for a standard supportive playstyle, any of the weapons that I mentioned earlier, like Favonius Codex, Prototype Amber, Thrilling Tales, his signature weapon, or even potentially Hokushin Ring, are all great options depending on what you need, with the Prototype Amber being my personal favorite as a great stat stick that otherwise didn't really have too many uses. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Baiju's Constellations. First of all, I want to say that I believe he's a great character at C0, and since he's primarily a Dendro support and healer, investing in his Constellations typically isn't what I recommend. However, he does have some pretty good early ones that I did want to touch on. With that said, I do plan on keeping my Baizhu at C0. Obviously, I have all of them here because I am on a media server in case I want to try them out, but this isn't my main account. But anyways, what his Constellations do are the following. His first Constellation will give you another charge of your skill, which is nice for more energy, meaning that when you swap into him after, let's say, 20 seconds, you can just use your skill twice and get more energy. His second Constellation is going to be the main one for people that want to stop at an early point, as it will make Baizhu passively deal Dendro damage just all the time as your active character hits opponents. You don't need to swap into him or use any ability for this to work. It will just passively deal a little bit of Dendro damage, which is considered elemental skill damage. What this means is the following. First of all, you'll get more Dendro application passively from off field, and secondly, since this is considered skill damage, it can actually make the Tenacity of the Millith set a bit more viable, although as I mentioned in the artifact set section, since this effect can only be triggered once every 5 seconds, it still isn't the best uptime, so keep that in mind, but it definitely makes the set more viable if you can use the buff as a decent supportive option. Moving on, your C3 and 5 give you talent levels, which are kind of whatever, and then your C4 will give all of your party members 80 elemental mastery after you use your burst. This is pretty good, especially if multiple characters in your team need EM, or if you're using Baizhu in like a bloom team or reaction teams in general, as a nice passive, but it's not like the biggest constellation. Similarly, your C6, while it is good, again, isn't like a game-breaking constellation, at least when compared to some other limited C6 5-star characters. In fact, what it does is it will significantly increase your Baiju's personal damage, so it'll gain damage based on your max HP, while also giving you bonus shields when your elemental skill or like your C2's effect will hit an opponent. This means more shields and more damage to your Baizhu, but again, since Baizhu typically isn't the carry of your team, it just makes them definitely a stronger support from off field or a more viable DPS character, so like pretty good, definitely has its upsides, but not like a game-breaking constellation, at least from my understanding right now. Overall though, his constellations are pretty decent, with C2 being a nice early stopping point. However, as I said, C0 Baizhu is perfectly good and typically what I would recommend as a high value character without needing extra copies. Alright, next up, let's get into one of the most important sections of this video, which is regarding Baiju's best teams. Now, as I mentioned in the playstyle section, Baizhu has a pretty good role of being a Dendro healing support character, which means that he can be used in many different teams where you want just that. You want the 2-in-1 convenience of having a healer and a Dendro applier who can apply this Dendro from off field while also providing you with some shields. Because of that, there are many teams that can use him, especially because he doesn't need to be swapped into a lot, as long as you're playing around his weaknesses of 1, needing a lot of energy, which means you can oftentimes run him with another Dendro character, and 2, not having the most Dendro application, especially against large groups of enemies, which means that you can also run him with another Dendro character, or run him in teams that don't need the most Dendro application, or run him on field for more Dendro as a driver in teams that can use him in that way. Overall, I believe his best teams are the following. First of all, you can use him with Cyno as a really good, just additional support for your Cyno. You can use him from off field, have his shield and Dendro application last for most of your Cyno's bursts, and then not have to swap out of your Cyno. So many other Dendro characters don't have as good of an uptime or have to reapply their Dendro to new enemies, like for example with Nahita's Mark, which means that for Cyno, having this Dendro application when you're inside of your burst passively without having to swap out can be a lifesaver. I really like Cyno with Baizhu, and it's one of the teams that I recommend the most. And a note for fellow Cyno players out there, since I have been testing a lot of Cyno Baizhu teams, I want to say the following. I believe Cyno's strongest teams meta-wise are Hyper Bloom or Quick Bloom teams, where you're proccing a bit of Quicken but also getting Hyper Bloom. And in those teams, with a fast Hydro Plier, you typically want another Dendro character on top of your Baizhu. Baiju's still good here, but you kind of need more Dendro if you actually want to proc both Quicken and Hyper Bloom, unless you're neglecting your aggravates and just Hyper Blooming, in which case just Baizhu is fine. But generally speaking, I would run another Dendro character here, or you could do an aggravate team, a Quicken team comp, which we'll talk about shortly. But in those teams, Baizhu can be enough Dendro because you don't need as much Dendro application, whereas if you're also Hyper Blooming, you will need more. So keep that in mind in case you plan on playing Cyno. Your team is very flexible, it's just that how much Dendro you need depends on the reactions you're playing, and Baizhu is typically enough for Quicken, but not quite enough for Hyper Bloom without another Dendro character. Another carry you can run Baizhu with is actually Alhaitham for a similar reason, where you won't have to swap out, and he can be a second Dendro option, giving you energy and also the elemental resonance. The last slot here can be flexible, and while the Dendro application won't be be as good as, for example, having Nahida here if you want to proc stuff like Hyper Bloom alongside your spreads. It's still good enough and can definitely be a very strong option, especially in a spread-focused team comp. Other characters you can use include our furry friend Cyno, who can benefit from having another Dendro character who can also heal you, allowing you to run double Dendro with double Electro, or just one Electro and a flex slot with some bonus healing and Dendro damage. You can also run him with Chengsheng, as in an aggravate team, you don't need the most Dendro application, and he can be a pretty decent slot in a team where someone like Yao Yao would already have been good. Baizhu can also be for similar reasons. You just want the most Electro as possible, and a Nemo option to swirl your Electro, and then you just have a really good team comp, making Baizhu a great option for these quicken teams, either procking aggravate or procking spread. Moving on, for the other teams, Baizhu can be used in Hyper Bloom. He can be on field here if you want more Dendro application, or you could run him off field if you're running another Dendro character, and then you could just spam Hyper Bloom. Note, I wouldn't recommend using him off field as the only Dendro support because of his slower Dendro application, as I mentioned, but especially on field in these teams, he can be really good unless you plan on running an on field Dendro user. For Burgeon teams, while Baizhu can work similarly on field, I don't think he's the best option because he's very single target, and Burgeon teams typically are AoE focused team comps, but you can definitely use him if you want to. Also, regarding Baiju's synergy in a Nilou team, while this may need a bit more testing because Nilou teams can be a bit wonky to sort of figure out what's going on at times, Baizhu can definitely work as a Dendro healer and applier, but I don't think he's like necessarily the best option depending on what you're doing. Again, he's very single target, and I typically would prefer like Yao Yao here for the AoE. You can use him on field if you want a Dendro auto attacker and healer and don't have someone like Nahida who would typically be used on field. I think the convenience of having him as a 2-in-1 here is nice, but I don't think he's necessarily the best option because Yao Yao, for example, in AoE, when there's a lot of enemies, can actually just apply more Dendro and can use a bit of time on her burst on field in a Nilou team where you don't really have a specific character you need to stay on. Furthermore, someone like Nahida is typically more recommended on field because of the insane amount of Dendro she applies if you do want to run something like a triple Hydra team, but I think that Baiju's versatility and healing can be appreciated in a Nilou team as well if it's something you just want to play, with my personal favorite Baizhu teams being these quicken ones that focus on either aggravate or spread. Or Quick Bloom, I guess, where you're mixing in Hyper Bloom as well on top of the quickens. Overall, Baiju's teams are very straightforward. I don't think it's that hard to go wrong with him. Just if you want a Dendro healer, typically from off field, but he can also be an on field driver in quick swappy teams where you can do some auto attacks on him, especially if you run something like Kukushin Ring to buff your Electro based team. So many different ways to play him. Who did a good job at showing them off in this video. And while I can't show every single team, the team archetypes that I mentioned are the ones where he will shine the most, and then you can kind of slot in the characters that you have or want to use. I really like his synergy with Cyno or carries that don't want to have to swap out because of how his shield will refresh, apply Dendro, and heal your party members. Alright, now with that said, we're gonna get into a showcase in the floor 12 of the current Spiral Abyss, where we're going to be playing Baizhu with Cyno. Obviously, Baizhu has a lot of teams, but I think he has really good synergy with Cyno, so we might as well play this team. All the characters I'm using are C0 in this team. My Cyno, who's gonna be the main DPS, is high investment, but he is Constellation 0, and so is the Baizhu that we will be showcasing. No Constellations active, level 8 talents with a level 9 burst, a Favonius Codex, so a 4-star weapon, but with some refinements, with 40k HP or a bit over, and enough energy recharge. Overall, this is a really good investment team, but obviously C0 characters, so you can know what to expect. Obviously, Baizhu has many teams, many of which use 4-star characters, and even some Cyno Baizhu teams can run 4-star supports like Xingqiu, or like the Dendro main character who is free, so keep that in mind. This is just one of the strongest teams that I want to showcase, because I believe Baizhu and Cyno have really good synergy with one another. With that said, I really hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
Mind the side effects. Seems like an emergency. Nowhere to run. Judgment is upon you. You stand condemned. Guilty. Their penance is due. Guilty. Remember, health comes first. Futile. Through me, justice is served. You stand condemned. Their penance is due. Guilty. Well played. He's taken for swallow. Taking a turn for the better. Nowhere to run. For swallow. Seems like an emergency.
Here comes the test.
Through me, justice is served. Guilty. Their penance is due. Guilty. You stand condemned. Guilty. Their penance is due. Surrender.
Quietly now. Game's up. Fun's over.
Mind the side effects. Taking a turn for the... Through me, justice is served. You stand condemned. Guilty. Your penance is due. You stand condemned. Your penance is due. Guilty.
Busted. Here comes the cash.
Remember, health comes first.
The doctor. Let's wait for you.
Yuta, judgment is upon you. Your penance is due. Guilty.
And so yeah, my overall thoughts on Baizhu is he's the support character that I've honestly really been enjoying, especially as a Cyno kind of main, or at least player. I really like Baizhu, but I don't want to overhype him because there is replacements for him. Like you can use Yao Yao, who can be better in AoE, with Baizhu being better in single target, and on field, characters like Nahida or Alhaitham can carry a bit better, but Baizhu definitely has his role as either a second Dendro option or a Dendro 2-in-1 healer, especially with characters like Cyno, or for quicken teams where a bit less Dendro is fine. Those are my thoughts on Baizhu. I don't want to repeat myself. I really like this character, and if there's anything new I want to add with regards to his power level, builds, or anything like that, it will be in a pinned comment since he is new, so there may be some changes in the future. Overall, I really hope this guide was helpful, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.